Hi, and welcome to flm204 here at FX PhD. I'm John Montgomery. Today we're going to continue taking a look at the flame smoke timeline, kind of obviously from the perspective of a flame artist, but hopefully you smoke folks will get something out of it. This is the way I approach it. I mean, I use it fairly simply, as you'll see. I know in talking to Jim Anarino, the smoke editor here, that he's using hotkeys all the time to work in the timeline. We're going to be using this FX Guide TV app again that we have with Angie. And normally we're just going to take a look at just some of the things that you might want to do with the batch setup. And especially today we're going to talk about editing from one clip to another. What we've got here is this rough cut, and when you're working on a spot or something, you're going to probably have a rough cut to compare it to. So the first step that you do after you've assembled a clip is to compare the two, make any trim adjustments that you might have. Because sometimes in telecine reels you can have a bit of float in those, especially when you're doing 30 to 24 stuff. So let's go ahead and head into batch and clear that out. I'll load in the episode assemble from XML and the rough cut. So we've got these two clips. Well, generally what I like doing when I'm working in batch is switching up to a 2-up view. And of course if you hit Control Home, you'll fit your viewer to that. And if you hold Control when you're dragging, you're going to want to, they're going to scale her correctly. And right now we've got this set up for the monitor. So like if you have a client supervised session, you can, determine what source is going to be fed to your monitor. So you can actually leave this down about this size. Go ahead and Control Home. It's actually going to fill the frame on your monitor. So that can be really useful if you've got a broadcast monitor right next to you. So anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the timeline here. One thing that you might want to check for sure is go to your setup and see what your audio monitoring is. I'm generally going to work, you can set audio context here. I'm just generally going to work with current. But what can be confusing, I'm going to go ahead and T-click to set my timeline duration, is I'm going to go ahead and select this and hit play, and you're actually not hearing anything. That's because you actually have to have this as your current active view. And then you'll actually be able to hear something. So go into setup, you've got current setup. Got this, and we'll go ahead and now we can actually hear the audio from our setup as we're playing it. That can be actually quite confusing at first for you when you're working. So anyway, just something to remember. So let's go ahead, and what we want to do, we talk about having separate video layers, and so we can do vertical compositing. Your instinct might be, if you're like me, especially when you're working in certain other applications, is to go ahead and kind of like drag from here to your timeline. Now you can do this in Smoke, okay, but you can't actually do this in Flame. You have to actually have a hotkey modifier because, again, I guess this is a legacy thing because in Flame this is always just drag things off. So what you want to do when you're dragging, what we can do is we're going to go ahead and do an Alt-Shift drag, and that's going to actually drag a copy down. So we'll set here like this, Alt drag, and if I drop this down, you see that arrow switches, and it's going to drop it here to Video 1 Layer 2. And where's it going to drop to? It's going to depend upon how you have this set up. In this case, we have Snap Closest here. What I'm generally going to do is have Snap Transition or, Snap Closest. In this case, I'm going to do Snap Transition. So we'll undo that. I'll take this and I'll go back. What you're going to want to do is go ahead and Alt-B. We talked about this last time that B and N took to back and next, I guess, in the Flame. It's actually going to be different in Smoke. It's going to be Z and X. So we'll go ahead and, even though I'm focused here, if I just hit B, it would take me to the end, or N to the end, because it's going to ignore these layers down here. If you want it to look at the nearest transition on any layer, then you just do Alt-B. Okay, so that's what I've got going here. So I'll go ahead and I'll go back to the beginning here, and then I'll go ahead and Alt-Shift drag this down. You can also actually do Control-Shift, which will just drag this down here and drop it. And I had Snap Transition on, so what I want to do is Snap Positioner, and we'll go ahead and drag this down, and it's going to snap to the positioner. And again, it drops it in. And you can see what's happened here. We've got the letterbox. The default resize, if we go ahead and set that, look at this, it's actually set to center crop. What you want to do, if you want to change that, just go to your preferences. And if you go to timeline, soft resize, this is the default. So if you want to change crop edges, center crop, whatever, that's where you set that. So I'll just go ahead now, and I'll go ahead and change this to crop edges. and now it's going to size correctly. Go ahead and do this, Control Home here, and we can see that we've got this overlaid on top of our background. All right, so the next thing to do is we're going to want to have some transparency, right? You might want to go ahead and just instinctively reach to the blend mode to do that, but that's not actually what I do. It can be kind of confusing. Again, we've got blend mode preference here. It's set to constant. That's also, I think here, constant blend. You can set that. You can have it automatically default to fade in, fade out, or fade out. The thing about the constant blend is it's actually going to set it always on the first keyframe here. All right, so if you don't have auto key on, for instance, it's not going to do anything. So what we can do is we'll set that to 100, and that should stay at 100. We'll go back here and set this to 50, and now you can see that it's actually blending between all of the background or all of our new layer, okay? I find that a little confusing, so I'll go ahead and Alt reset that, and I'm going to go ahead and do an axis effect. Because the axis effect allows us to do transparency kind of on the fly wherever we want, okay? So I can just kind of fade this in and out based upon where I am. It's maybe a little slower to react, but I'm not too worried about that. The other thing is, if you want to do this, is you can go ahead and turn the resize back on. All right, by default it turns it off, but we'll go ahead and add both a resize and a blend. And you can actually see here now a little bit of problems here in the slippage. So all we have to do is go ahead and slip that and adjust that. Before we continue, I'm just going to go ahead and step out here and talk about those two gestural editing timeline hotkeys that we've got. Go ahead and go down here to the end and pan this down and make sure it's visible. These are the hotkeys that you have for your editing, gestural editing to the timeline in both Flame and Smoke. As I mentioned, in Smoke you can just drag, and then you use the copy modifier F in Smoke to do a copy clip drag. So let's go ahead and go back into Batch and take a look at what we've got. And in general, like I said, we're going to take a look at comparing the work picture. And here you can see you just want to do a little slipping. So this just makes it really easy to slip. So again, we'll just go ahead and get our hotkey and slip it around here. And one thing is if it's kind of hard to get close sometimes, what you can do is you can use the, if you hold down the Alt and slip hotkey and then use the right and left arrows, you can trim one frame at a time to get to line up, and it ends up being a lot easier. So you can go and kind of check, and that's looking pretty good. So I know you do a lot of keyboard editing. There are a ton of keyboard shortcuts, and I know you Smoke folks out there probably do a ton of it. It's just not something I do because I really don't do a lot of creative editing right in the timeline. My kind of stuff is just the stuff that I'm showing you today of what you might be doing. All right, so let's go ahead and here's another thing that's off, but I'll just go ahead and leave that like that for now. Let me go ahead and show the other way of doing things. So let's go ahead and take this. I'm going to go ahead and drag this down, deleting that, and let's go ahead and show just the hotkeys for actually editing into the timeline. And the two main ones that I end up using are the marking hotkeys. And so you have these that are mark in and mark out. These are the Flame ones. You have dedicated keys within Smoke to allow you to mark in and mark out. Then you also have, these are the editing operations. You have overwrites, inserts, and appends. And on the Flame, the reason these are like this and not unified is just because there are so many hotkeys in the Flame. They didn't want to redo every single hotkey in Batch, so they went ahead and left this like this. And then in Smoke, again, you have dedicated keys. Now, even though these seem really strange, there are labels on the Smoke keyboard for this. And this actually follows the keyboard layout of the old CMX and Grass Valley style editors when Smoke and Fire, and not first came out, but I think it was like version 3, they made their hotkeys the same as other editors. So, again, that's a change that's been there for a while. So we'll talk about using these. So let's go ahead and go back into Batch. And the key thing in thinking about this here is that you have these hotkey operations. And what you need to be able to do is you need to be able to tell I'm getting from the source to some other thing. And that's where you have the difference between a record and a source timeline. Now in Smoke, it's just dedicated because you have this record timeline down at the bottom. But in Flame, you can have it anyway. So what you need to do is we'll change this FX Guide TV up to be a record timeline. So what's going to happen is whenever you hit a hotkey, this clip is going to receive the operations. All right, this is also true within Batch effects and so forth, obviously in Smoke. So what we're going to go ahead and do, and basically I'm going to just go ahead and go back to the beginning of this. And I know, notice this length is the same here, 6724 and 6724. And all I need to do is go ahead. I'm going to switch this to just stay on my record focus all the time, and that's F8. So go ahead and hit Control Home. And then just come over here, and we'll select this source clip, and what we're going to do is go ahead and hit O for overwrite. And you can see we overwrote the clip here in this layer. And notice that it did our default resize, which is crop edges. And so there we've got that all set up and ready to go. I'll go ahead and undo that. Now notice if I move my record focus or my focus down here, the primary track, if I go ahead and hit O here, it's actually going to overwrite that. Okay, so you want to be really careful when you're doing that you actually target your layers in the correct place. So go ahead and do that. O for overwrite. All right. So that's our first hotkey. Let's go ahead and do some other stuff. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and remove that for now. Let's go ahead and take a look here and see what I'm yammering on about. And what we'll do, I got to go ahead and I got to reset. I had to restart in between here. Let's go ahead and just, I'm going to mark this as my in. So go ahead and mark in. Go ahead and hit play and mark it out. And let's go ahead and zoom in and you can see what happens. You've got the left and the right brackets. And let's go ahead and pull in a clip, Control Tab in from the desktop. Let me just get some B-roll shots that I've got here. So I get kind of 3 B-roll shots. Now what you can do is actually, there's explicit points. Let's say we mark these 2 points here in our record timeline. So we've got these 2 points set up here. You can see that we've got them set. And then what we can do is if you just mark a single in point on another clip, then it's going to kind of implicitly find an out point in general. Okay, so let's go ahead and just find a good section here where I'm not going too crazy with shaking. So let's go ahead and let's use mark collar in here. So go ahead and mark in here. And now if I go ahead and do an overwrite, we'll go ahead and add that shot in here along the top. It's doing a little bit of a resize because of an aspect ratio, but if you go ahead and play this in,
little alternative for reference monitors,
you can actually see that we've got that set up. There we go, running down, cut out like that. And what's nice about it is doing this, those of you who do Final Cut, the vertical editing is kind of nice. If I had done that with this record focus down there and hit overwrite, you can see you just drop that clip right here in this bottom layer. And that's just another approach. Again, you just want to be cognizant of what's going on. Now, where that gets interesting or not so interesting, let's say we want to go ahead and say insert the clip here. And so we'll just, we'll start out here with the B-roll on this shot. And then I'll go ahead and mark out. And let's just say we want to do this in order to kind of have less of a jarring transition from me here to me on camera here. So go ahead and come back here. I'm just going to go ahead and set that to the result. Let's go ahead and set this and find some Barco B-roll. Go ahead and mark in there. All right, so let's talk about and show you how these various things work when you're using insert and overwrite as well. We'll go ahead and switch back to my record timeline here. Now if I hit an O, you can see what happens. Actually, let me undo that and zoom out and hit home. We'll do an O for overwrite, and you can see what happens. We just overwrote that layer. But let's talk about insert. If we go ahead and hit insert, what happens is it just ripples everything down, changing the duration of the timeline. Now everything here is off sync because we did that, okay? So that's actually what kind of what happens when you do insert. So we'll go ahead and undo that. So in this case, overwrite is generally what you want to do, whether it's on this layer or it's on this layer up here. And the last thing that we want to go ahead and talk about is we want to go ahead and talk about append. And what append does is we'll append it to the end of the current focus layer. So let's go ahead and hit A, and you can see what happens. We went ahead and appended that clip down to the end, and since we hadn't marked it out, you can see that it had tails of 0, because what happens is append will ignore the mark in and out, because obviously append means add it to the end. Okay, so go ahead and undo that. If we want to come here and and set an out point like that. Come back to our record clip and hit A. Now we've just got a very short clip here at the end that gets appended. Okay, so those are our three things that we just talked about: overwrite, insert, and append. Now the next ones that are kind of interesting that I can show you are replace, and then replacing keeping soft effects. Okay, so let's go ahead here and go back into our timeline. Go ahead and undo that last change, or just drag that down. I just don't have that there anymore. Now let's say that I just want to go ahead and let's just find a shot. I don't really have a good shot here that I want to replace it with, but let's go ahead and just take this shot, and let's say we want to replace it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and mark the actual segment that I'm resting on, and you saw the hotkey for that. So you can see that I got an in and out point there. And what's interesting about replace is you can actually replace a shot and keep the soft effects. So let's go ahead and just select this, take the color correct, and let's just take our saturation down to 0. So it's obvious that we have a soft color correction on this node. And then if we go ahead and take, say, this clip here and replace it, let's go ahead and just find a clip here. I don't really care what it is. Oh, that's snazzy. Let me go ahead and mark in there. And if we select this, let's go ahead and hit R. What happens when you do replace is going to replace that shot, but it's going to do it with a fit and a fill. Okay, so it actually replaced the whole thing. And you can see that it didn't maintain the soft effect. So in this case, replace, I generally just go ahead and do an override edit. But where it gets interesting, if you want to do, is a shift replace. If I do that now, what will happen is I've got this selected like here. I'm going to go ahead, and it's going to be Control-Shift-R. And it says that is invalid. Well, let's go ahead and see why that might be invalid. There are a couple things, and the reason I selected this clip is just to let you know of some of the problems with doing this. If you're not aware of them, it can cause problems of, hey, why isn't this working? It has to do with some of the resolution and soft resizing. By doing this replacing, what we're doing actually is we're saying, okay, I want to keep only the soft effects that were here. That's only the color correct. What's happening is we've got two things going on, okay? We've got this clip that says it's 8-bit, okay? And we're editing it into a 12-bit timeline. So what we want to do is you want to go in here to the LUT, go ahead and activate that, so we're going into 12. The next thing that we want to do also is this is a 960 by 720, and it's a 1280 by 720. Now, ordinarily when you're doing an overwrite clip, okay, that's going to be not a problem, because if we just go ahead and hit overwrite, it's going to do a soft resize, right? You don't have to worry about that. But when you're doing the Control-Shift-Replace to swap it out, it can't do a soft resize because you're saying you don't want one. So let's go ahead and do resize, active. We'll change this and just make sure that the soft resize here, actually I did that to the wrong one. I did that there. I want to do a soft resize on our source clip. So active, and we've got it set up to fill to 1280 by 720. And we've got the LUT set up. All right, so now we should be able to go ahead. And now let's go ahead and do Shift-Control-R. Operation is invalid. What's the deal here? The final thing that we need to take a look at, again, this is kind of an extreme case for you guys. If we take a look at this, there's no kind of nomenclature how long our duration of our edit is here. We can hold duration here, and you can see that it's actually 1106. You can also get that information here under basic. You can see the duration is 1106. If we come up here, our duration is 1102. All right, so we actually don't have enough media here to fit. So just to get around this really quickly, I'll go ahead and we'll switch this and slide this here like that. Okay, I'll go ahead and select this. Oops, I went ahead and did an edit operation on it. Go ahead and turn off trim. Let's go ahead and take this, and I'm going to go ahead and mark the out. All right, now if I do Shift-Control-R, Shift-Control-R, we should go ahead and drop that into our clip. And kind of look what happens. It actually goes ahead and actually, if we take a look at this, we've got a resize on here. It doesn't actually interpret quite correctly. Just a bug here, actually. So if we take of our resize here, we'll go ahead and do a fill, and now we'll get back. So it's kind of funny that it actually didn't take those settings. It carried over the resize, but did it incorrectly. So again, it's kind of the worst case scenario, I will admit, for editing that. But that holds true if you have, for most cases, you're going to have kind of source material that's going to fit within your timeline. So that's not going to be such a big deal after all. Let's go ahead and confirm those again. Replace. But more importantly, I think what I'm using is I'm using the Shift Control R, excuse me, on that. Just makes it much easier, really cool if you're just swapping out new versions of something. Say you're doing a grade but a repo, really easy to swap things in your timeline if you have soft effects on it. So what I want to do now is show a little bit of vertical compositing and taking that into post-batch effects to do work with it. It's a nice way of being able to time things out versus timing things out in action or on the desktop and so forth. And once you get used to doing it, it's really, really nice. If we take a look at this segment that we've got here, let's go ahead and play it down. We have Angie introducing us, and we want to do a side-by-side box with a lower third during this duration. So let's go ahead and I'll go ahead and load from the edit desk. Let's go ahead and load in the lower third side-by-side alpha, the matte, as well as the background. And so we've got this background here that will have animating behind us, and then we've got this fancy graphic that we've got. There are lots of ways of doing this, but this is kind of the way I like working. So let's go ahead first here and just pick out the timing of where we want things to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and set mark an in and out to determine that. I'll back up a little bit.
Hope you do like the changes. But enough of me rambling on. John, what have you
Cut
got
to me.
this week, and where are you?
And
Thanks for that, Angie. Well, the show is wrapped.
okay, cut back to me. Notice we only have 24 frames of Angie there, so let's go ahead and just try and trim her out first. Go ahead and slide this and see. That's about as far as we can go with her. I don't have any more heads and tails than what we had uploaded. So go ahead and just mark out there. And again, it'll just be easier to do that. Just in general, it's nice to have a visual representation of where this is going to be. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a vertical stack of elements and then add some cuts here so I can just actually take those into a single batch setup. Go ahead and turn off trim, and what I'm going to do is first copy my clip so I can extend it back over that way, and then we'll have that. This is the area that's over the background and the side-by-side in between the in and the out. So if I go ahead and Alt-Shift, I've got Snap On to Positioner, so we've got that set up there. Go ahead and trim this back out now, and that should be pretty close. Again, we'll go ahead and, I'm not a numeric trimming guy. So we've got myself set up there. So if we go ahead and take a look and drag back, I've got this, and obviously when I filmed this is inside behind the scenes. I didn't know what was going on. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add a time warp to this. And so I'm going to ramp. Hopefully in the side-by-side you won't notice the time warp. It's only going to be me that you're going to see. So let's go ahead and take this. And I'm going to do a time warp. Let's go ahead and go in and edit it. And where I'm resting, I'm going to go ahead and delete these points here. And I'm going to set a speed keyframe here. Okay, frame 89. And then here I'm just going to set my speed to say be 40. And so here will be slow here at the beginning, kicking up to 100. So let's go ahead and exit that out. And let's go ahead and just go ahead and render that really quickly. And see if that works, see if I look better.
There's enough of me rambling on. John, what have you got for me this week, and where are you? Thanks for that, Andy.
Okay, so I think that's going to actually work fine for us. So that's a nice little cheat. The next thing we'll do, let's go ahead and get our background going. And well, what I like doing when I'm layering stuff in my timeline, I'll go ahead and Control swap down and we can get a bigger timeline view for us, is layering them in an order that makes sense. And what I want to do is I want to add a layer below this and do that by hitting Control Load Plus. So now I've got a layer down here. I've got my in and out points marked. I've got the focus here. So let's just go ahead here to our background. I've got the transition I don't want to use, so I'll go ahead and mark in there. If I do an overwrite, there I've got my background set up right where we want it. Let's go ahead and add some other elements. And while I'm down here, I'm going to go ahead and mark the segment. Mark the in and out point, and then I'm going to add a layer on top. And that's going to be for the lower third. Actually, I'm going to do this, select that, and actually, sorry, keep hitting that. Go ahead and add that, and then a layer plus to add that there. I've got the lower third side by side, and that's got an animation on. So what I want to do is go ahead, and that's going to be my in on frame 16, and then I'll go ahead and do overwrite. That works out okay. I don't have any tails. I actually don't have enough there, but we can actually remedy that with a time warp as well. Now, one quick way of kind of dealing with these when you're kind of working and lining things up is to do a matte container if you want. What I can do is I'll go ahead and take this clip, and if we add an axis effect, you can actually pull a matte along with this from the desktop. So I'll go ahead and say matte, and I'm going to go ahead and take this from my desktop. And now we've got a matte and a fill on the same layer, but if we scroll back, I've got actually the wipe on happening. So we want to go in here, as I can go in and edit the container, and then I'm just going to go ahead and trim this in. Say 15, and then just go ahead and take the trim out, and I'm going to snap the positioner and just snap this back here, drag that down like that, and I've got things lined up. That's a crude way of doing it. I'm sure you smug guys probably have a better way of doing it, but that's how, as Tal would say, that's how I roll. So let's go ahead, and we'll go ahead and exit out of the container and get back to our main batch setup. And there we've got the clip there. Now I'm not worried about blending modes or anything at this point. That's not going to be a problem for me. But what is going to be a problem is actually setting this freeze frame at the end. So what we want to do is I'll go ahead and go in here and select this and just hit a time warp on that baby. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and say, I'm going to anchor the in on this case. And then at this point, what I want to do is I'm just going to set the speed here. I'll go back one frame. I'll go ahead and set the speed here to be 100. Actually, go back one more. Set it to be 100. And go ahead here. And I'm going to go ahead and set 0. And if you remember from before, what we can do is we can just go ahead and control drag down this time warp for us. So I've got the same time warp on each frame. And if we exit out of the container, I can actually just then I should be able to trim. I cannot trim because I got to go ahead and trim these out here. Go ahead and trim these out a little bit. And then in my main timeline, I have a little bit more to go, so I can go ahead and trim out to the edge of that container if I want. So go ahead and zoom in here. Go ahead and just trim this out to here. And now I've got those all set up at the right duration. If we take a look at this, that's actually keying on top of it. All right, the last thing that I want to do is go ahead and what I want to do is add some cut points here on Angie, okay, because what we've got is I've got her, but I want her to be a separate element here down here. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll go to the next transition here, bring my focus down and add a cut there. And then let's go ahead and just scroll back in time and take a look at her and see where we're at here at the beginning. And go ahead here. Go back like that, go ahead and scroll down, and I'm going to add a cut point there. And the reason I do that now, as you can see, is that I've got all these as kind of a separate, kind of distinct little layer that we've got going on here on our timeline. I could drag more of this into a batch effects if I wanted to, but it's just going to take a lot longer to render and so forth because I've got all this stuff going on the sides. So when I'm working, I generally prefer to kind of have it set up like this. And you'll see what I mean. What will happen now is I'm going to go ahead and hit the post button. And now what I have is I get dropped into a post batch effects where I've got the spare here, I've got this set up here with heads and tails. These heads and tails came with me even though I'd set those delete points or cut points. But if I exit out of the batch effects, this is the cool part. What I've got here in my vertical compositing is I've got this single batch effects layer where I've got everything contained. All right, so that can be really cool. I've got those all layered down in here in my batch effects where I can just do my effects that I want to do with this. So what do we want to do with this? What I want to do is I want to take all these layers, all right, and I want to kind of explode these into an action setup to do my compositing. I actually could do this compositing if I wanted to, probably in the timeline, but I'm an action kind of guy. I'm a flame guy. That's what I do. So let's go ahead and just take all these elements here. And what we can do is we can split these out. And we can split these out into split them and convert to action layers. So now what I've got, and you can see kind of why I've got these things laid out the way I want them. I've got my background here, I've got Angie, me, and the lower third all laid out in action layers. And so that can be really cool. Now the other thing that I want to do is we can go ahead and now go ahead and take this and actually get rid of this container. So I'll go ahead and take this and go ahead and mute the container, turning it off. And now I've got my alpha here, easily accessible. So all I need to do is go ahead and disconnect this. Well, I didn't need to do that first, but I can actually drag this clip out here into my batch and do that. So now I've got a mat and a fill set up for me automatically, and that's kind of why I ended up using the containers. Just when I was working, it was easy to do. Actually, one thing that I forgot to do before I did this is generally what I like doing is making a copy of everything that I have set up. So let's actually see here. Yeah. We can go in here, and basically what I like doing is taking a copy of this and kind of setting it off to the side. All right, and then redoing that. So now what I can do is I can go ahead and take these. Let's go ahead and split them into action layers. Go ahead and take this, go ahead and turn the container off, drag this out like this, and then I can just connect that like that. All right. And then I've got this kind of as a backup. So that would be pretty useful. So what I'll go ahead and do now is I'll bring in the mat for these layers, and we'll do a little kind of front or mat source replacement. So what we can do is we can do this a couple different ways. I can add them directly, or let's go ahead and bring them in from the edit desk. And we'll have Angie be on the left, and I'll be on the right. I'll go ahead and go in and set that up. What I want to do though is I'll go ahead and use source nodes. Source nodes are the best things. I generally don't use the DB objects at all. Those of you who've taken my classes before probably know that. So I'll go ahead and add a front source here for Angie. So I'll take Angie and then reposition her over like this. I'll actually reduce her as much as I can. I don't have a ton of room, but I can reduce her and position her up like that. And then I'll go ahead and do the same thing with me. Go ahead and add a front source. Myself, I actually kind of want to make myself a little bit bigger, so I'm kind of the same size as Angie. At least get the eye line in the same position. I'll go ahead and do that. And so now we've got this set up like this. And of course, what we could do is we could add, as we generally do, is probably add shadows and so forth to this to render. But if I go ahead and now exit out of the batch effects here, I've got this set, and we'll go ahead and process that. And we'll just render that little section. Again, you can see now, because I just did this, at least in my thinking, I did it in a smart way. I'm just editing this little batch effects segment by itself. So the processing is going to be much faster than kind of rendering this whole timeline out. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, remember I did this clip, I did this time warp. It's kind of superfluous now. I was just kind of setting that up, so I can go ahead and delete this layer once this is done processing. And that way I won't have a time warp set in, a needless time warp when it's just running at a 100% speed anyway. So this is just about ready to wrap up. And I'll go ahead and drag this down to the trash. Go ahead and bring my record focus up here. Might as well hit home. And let's go ahead and see what's happening. Actually, I got a clip over here.
Be changing dramatically with a few special.
Go ahead and get a little closer to that cut there for you guys so you don't have to sit through it. Occasionally this happens. We get a little bit of an update problem.
Dramatically with a few special shows. So I hope you do like the changes. But enough of me rambling on. John, what have you got for me this week, and where are you?
Thanks for that, Andy, while the show is wrapped. Okay, so I could tighten up that edit of myself, I guess, a little bit. Probably should have done that to start with. But again, you get the idea of how that can be used and how you can take and do a post batch effects to things. And again, the thing that I like doing, as I mentioned before, is if we go into here, go ahead and edit in the batch effects, you can see that I've got my original copy here set up with the multiple layers. You can see that I've got set up, and hopefully that won't ruin the cache because I actually didn't do anything within that scene. So now one more thing I want to talk about is the ability to take and use soft effects and transfer them into, say, batch exploding nodes, so to speak. So let's go ahead and we'll go up here and we'll find Angie. And one thing I didn't really mention last week that I like doing is actually going in, and before you make modifications to things, use your layers as a kind of versioning tool, right? So let's go ahead and I'm going to Alt-Shift drag these up. I'm going to leave those the way they are, and I'm actually going to work here with Angie to do some grading. And again, we did this a little bit last week. I'm just going to do really simple grading on her. Go in and just do that same old stuff that I've been doing. Let's go ahead and increase the contrast a bit. Take and grade it a little bit like this, and let's go ahead and take her midtones and just add it, make them a little more like that. All right, so that's what I'm going to do to that. We'll go ahead and then we want to add a spark effect on top of this. Go ahead and load up Vignette. And edit it. And you know what, came up with that, so we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so we've got that going on. And if you remember correctly, you can really easily drag and copy these from one clip to another. So we can go ahead and undo. Control drag that. I'll drag that spark there and there, as well as the color correction as well. And so we've got those all kind of the same. All right, but let's say you wanted to do something and kind of have a little finer control when we're working. And this isn't necessarily kind of the best example. But what we can do here is we looked at doing a pre-version of something last time. But what I'm going to do is I want to take these spark and color correct and do a post version. All right, so go ahead and hit post. Vertical compositing may be lost. Yes, we know that. We'll go ahead and come back out, and you can see what happens. We've got a batch effects, and you can see that the soft effects are gone. We'll come in here to batch effects, and if you take a look at this, you can see that we've got the soft effects right here within our batch effects. So what we can do is go ahead and take these, and by doing Control, we can multi-select them. And if I just drag them out anywhere here, what will happen is they get inserted into our batch graph. So we've got color correct here, and then we've got the spark, and then out in the batch effects. Okay, so that's just a quick showing of how you can actually take and explode your soft effects. And of course, they're gone from this clip, and now they're individual batch nodes that you can do. Say if you wanted to do a fix, or do something like move around or do something different. So again, you can work with these soft effects and batch effects in a lot of different ways. And of course, just similar to what you have to do here, you'd have to go ahead and process that timeline to have our clips processed. But again, lots of different ways in which you can work within batch and set things up. The key is to, I think, keep things organized in these couple ways. Use the timeline and use the vertical compositing functionality of timeline to save previous versions of what you've done, just like what we did here. So if you have a client or something that doesn't like a change that you made, you don't get bagged by having those in. You've got a history literally of that from this right here, but you've also got a previous version stacked out in your timeline as well for management. It's a really great task for being able to version things, and also just if you want to say, okay, hey, before, after, especially useful here in this case if you're kind of tweaking the grade on something. Undo. Here and here and here, so you could actually have your color correct set up here, go like that, and actually start adjusting the saturation further if you want on top of that, or whatever you want to do if you've just done the quick color correction. In my case, I'd actually dove in, so you have to kind of dive in and change that. But again, it's a great way to kind of do versions and compare A/B versions with everything, as well as actually get things set up for more complex vertical editing as well. Well, that's it for the second timeline editing class that we've got here in flm204. Next week, we'll definitely be diving back into expressions with some cool stuff that we showed on the Asia Master class, some stuff from CE-ROM, as well as some other cool stuff. If you have any questions or want to expand on this in the forums, please feel free to do so. I'll be the first to admit that from a smoke editing perspective, I don't use all the timeline and features that we have for editing within Flame. I just think that the UI is not kind of set up with that. I find kind of using batch to do all the editing a bit clunky, so I don't do that much creative editing in it. And this is just the way I personally approach projects when I'm working in them. There's a ton of different ways to do them. If you guys have good tips and tricks, love to hear them in the forums. And until next week, as always, thanks for being part of FX PhD. See ya.